Chapter 6. The Evolution of Currency Standards. 1. The concept of seigniorage and royal minting prerogatives. In the late medieval and early modern periods, producing gold coins was not merely a public service. It was one of the most guarded and lucrative rights of the sovereign. This power was manifested through something called seigniorage, the difference between the face value of a coin and the actual cost of the metal plus its minting expenses. By exercising the royal minting prerogative, a monarch could extract a tax on every ounce of gold that entered the kingdom's circulation. This transformation of raw bullion into legal tender was a sacred act of statecraft, effectively turning a physical commodity into a political instrument backed by the king's authority. The management of seigniorage was a delicate balancing act. If the king set the seigniorage too high, merchants would avoid the royal mint, taking their gold to foreign markets or illegal private mints. Conversely, if it was too low, the treasury would lose the revenue necessary to maintain the mint's integrity. This minting price became a critical economic indicator. It dictated the flow of gold across borders, determined the relative strength of national currencies. The royal seal on a gold coin was more than an emblem of pride. It was a certificate of monetary purity, allowing the king to manage the liquidity of his entire realm. However, the prerogative of minting also provided monarchs with a dangerous temptation: debasement. By subtly reducing the weight or the fineness of the gold content while maintaining the face value of the coin, a king could secretly increase his seigniorage to fund wars, to pay off crown debts. This was often justified as a monetary reform, but in reality it was a hidden tax on the populace. In England and France during the 14th and 15th centuries, these frequent mutations of the gold standard led to intense friction between the crown and the rising merchant classes, who demanded a fixed and honest currency to protect their international contracts. Ultimately, the evolution of minting prerogatives led to the birth of the modern legal tender concept. It established that the value of gold as money was not just determined by the market, but by the fiat, the decree of the state. This era proved that while gold was a natural substance, its function as a currency was a social and political construct. The struggle over who controlled the mint and who pocketed the seigniorage laid the groundwork for the eventual emergence of central banks, shifting the power over gold from the king's personal whim to the institutionalized rules of national finance. 2. Gresham's Law, the conflict between gold and silver. The history of gold money is inseparable from its long and turbulent relationship with silver, famously summarized by a principle known as Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good. Although named after Sir Thomas Gresham, a financial advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, the phenomenon had been observed centuries earlier by monetary experts like Orson and Copernicus. In a bimetallic system where both gold and silver are legal tender at a fixed ratio, any discrepancy between the official mint rate and the actual market value triggers a mechanical displacement. If the state undervalues gold relative to the open market, merchants and bankers will hoard the good gold coins or melt them down for export, leaving only the overvalued bad silver coins in public circulation. This law paralyzed European economies for centuries. During the 14th and 15th centuries, France and the Holy Roman Empire were frequently drained of their gold reserves. Their mint ratios failed to keep pace with the shifting supply of metals from the East or the New World. When the market price of gold rose, the gold coins, being more valuable than their face value suggested, disappeared into private hoards. This created a persistent bullion famine that stifled large-scale commerce and forced monarchs into a desperate cycle of devaluations. The good money became a silent treasure, while the bad money became the only tool available for daily survival. The conflict reached a pitch fever in 17th century England. As the market ratio fluctuated, the English mint often found itself striking gold coins that were immediately snatched up by money changers to be sold at a profit in Amsterdam or Paris. This was not merely a financial annoyance, it was a threat to national security. A kingdom without gold was a kingdom that could not pay its foreign debts or fund its navy. Sir Isaac Newton, as master of the mint in 1717, attempted to solve this by revaluing the gold guinea, inadvertently setting England on a path toward a de facto gold standard. However, Gresham's law proved that as long as two metals were tied together by an arbitrary law, one would always eventually drive the other out of the marketplace. Ultimately, the struggle between gold and silver under Gresham's law forced the evolution of modern monetary theory. It taught economists that the intrinsic value of gold could not be ignored by legislative decree. This realization led to the gradual abandonment of bimetallism in favor of a monometallic standard. Gold's victory in the 19th century was, in many ways, the final resolution of the conflict described by Gresham, a recognition that for a global economy to function, it required a single, stable, and good anchor that would not be driven out by the whims of the market. 3. The confusion of nomenclature: florins, ducats, and nobles. One of the most persistent obstacles to the stabilization of the European gold economy was chaos, the chaotic diversity of monetary nomenclature. As gold coinage spread across the continent following the 13th century revival, a confusing proliferation of names and denominations emerged. While the Florentine florin and the Venetian ducat served as the initial archetypes, nearly every European prince, bishop, and free city began to issue their own versions. However, they rarely maintained the original weight or fineness. This resulted in a Babel of Gold, where the term florin might refer to a high-purity Italian coin in one market, but to a heavily debased German gulden in another. For the international merchant, the name of a coin was often a deceptive mask, hiding its true metallic value. This confusion was often a deliberate tool of statecraft. Monarchs would cry up or cry down the value of certain denominations by royal decree to attract foreign gold into their own mints. The French écu, the English noble, the Spanish escudo, all competed for dominance, but their relative values shifted constantly based on the whims of local legislation. A merchant traveling from London to Paris would find his English nobles were valued differently, depending on whether he was paying a tax to the king or buying wool from a Burgundian trader. This lack of standardized nomenclature meant that every major transaction required a professional, a money changer, an assayer, to determine the actual gold content of the assorted coins. This confusion was further compounded by the practice of clipping and sweating coins. Even if a coin bore a famous name like the ducat, its physical integrity was often compromised. Criminals and even unscrupulous officials would shave the edges of gold coins, accumulating the dust, returning the diminished piece into circulation. Over time, the nominal florin became a ghost of its former self, leading to a massive discrepancy between money by tale, counting the coins, and money by weight, melting them down. This forced the great trading houses of the Renaissance to conduct their large-scale business in bank money or book credits, based on a theoretical, unvarying gold unit, effectively bypassing the physical chaos of the marketplace. Ultimately, this era of nomenclature confusion proved that names alone could not sustain trust in a currency. It laid the groundwork for the eventual move toward a decimal system and the rigid standardization of the 19th century. The struggle to define what a florin or a noble truly was served as a long, painful education for European economists. It taught them that without a transparent, internationally recognized weight and fineness, gold could not fulfill its destiny as a universal medium of exchange. The resolution of this chaos would eventually lead to the birth of the British sovereign and the modern era of monetary precision. 4. The development of the modern law of tender. As the chaos of varied nomenclature and fluctuating metal values reached its peak, the modern nation-state was forced to intervene with a revolutionary legal concept: legal tender. Before this period, the acceptance of a gold coin was largely a matter of private agreement between a merchant and a buyer, based on the perceived weight and purity of the metal. But as economies became more complex, the state needed a mechanism to ensure that debts could be settled decisively and the tax revenues remained stable. The law of tender was thus established to dictate that certain coins, struck by the royal mint, must be accepted by every citizen at their face value for the discharge of any debt, public or private. This shift represented a fundamental change in the relationship between the citizen and the metal. By declaring a specific gold coin as legal tender, the sovereign was effectively providing a state guarantee of its value. This legal intervention was necessary to combat the effects of Gresham's law. When bad money began to drive out good money, the law of tender was used to artificially support the circulation of the overvalued metal. In England, the proclamation of 1663 regarding the gold guinea was a landmark moment, as the government sought to fix the value of gold in terms of silver shillings, creating a legal framework for a bimetallic standard. The development of the law of tender also introduced the concept of limit of tender. To protect the gold standard, many nations decreed that while gold was unlimited legal tender, meaning it could be used to pay any amount no matter how large, silver or copper coins were limited legal tender, useful only for small transactions. This legal hierarchy was the first step toward demonetization of silver. It established gold as the elite primary currency of the realm, while relegating other metals to a secondary token status. This ensured that the most important contracts of the nation, international loans, royal dowries, and military expenditures, were anchored in the most stable material available. However, the law of tender was a double-edged sword. While it provided stability, it also allowed the state to force its citizens to accept devalued or clipped coins at a value they didn't truly possess. This tension between the intrinsic value of the gold and the extrinsic value imposed by the law led to the first major legal and philosophical debates over the nature of money. Thinkers began to ask, is money a commodity whose value is determined by the market, or is it a creature of the law? The resolution of this debate in favor of the law of tender allowed for the eventual transition to paper money. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, it served primarily to crown gold as the undisputed king of the legal financial system. 5. The transition from bimetallism to the monometallic standard. The climax of early modern monetary history was a gradual and painful realization that the world could not serve two masters. For centuries, the bimetallic system, where both gold and silver functioned as co-equal standards, had been the norm. But the inherent instability of this system, plagued by the seesaw of Gresham's law, eventually became an intolerable burden for the industrializing nations of the West. The transition toward a monometallic gold standard was not a sudden decision. It was an evolutionary necessity. As global trade volumes increased, the constant fluctuations between the value of gold and silver began to act as a friction on progress. The world needed a single, unvarying anchor, and gold, with its higher value density and greater global prestige, was the natural candidate. The death knell for bimetallism was sounded first in England. Following Sir Isaac Newton's valuation in 1717, silver became significantly undervalued at the British Mint, leading it to flow out of the country as a commodity rather than circulating as money. By the time the 19th century dawned, silver had effectively disappeared from large-scale British commerce. In 1816, Lord Liverpool's Coinage Act officially established gold as the sole standard of value in the United Kingdom, relegating silver to a secondary role as token money for small change. This was the first formal adoption of the monometallic gold standard, a move that would eventually compel every other major power to follow suit, if they wished to trade with the world's leading financial empire. The transition was accelerated by the massive gold discoveries in California and Australia in the mid-19th century, which provided the necessary volume of gold to sustain a global monometallic system. Conversely, the discovery of enormous silver deposits, such as the Comstock lode, began to devalue silver so rapidly that nations like Germany and the United States feared their currencies would be dragged down by the depreciating white metal. The great demonetization of silver in the 1870s marked the final triumph of gold. Silver, once the money of the people, was stripped of its legal tender status for large debts, leaving gold as the undisputed king of international finance.
The move to a monometallic standard was essentially a victory for credibility over flexibility. While a bimetallic system allowed for more money to be in circulation, a gold-only system provided a level of certainty that allowed for the birth of long-term international lending and global capital markets. This transition laid the foundations for the classical gold standard of the late 19th century, an era of unprecedented price stability and global economic integration. Gold had finally won its millennia-long battle with silver, becoming the singular, shimmering measure of human labor and value.